وسلام على عباده الذين اصطفى أما بعد فقد قال الله تبارك وتعالى في القرآن المجيد والفرقان الحميد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم ولا تلقوا بأيديكم إلى التهلكة وقال أيضا ولنبلونكم وقال في شأن حبيبه الكريم إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما اللهم صل على سيدنا وشفيعنا ومولانا محمد معدن الجود والكرم وآله وأصحابه وبارك وسلم صلاة وسلاما عليك يا سيدي يا رسول الله. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has informed us again and again and again, whether it is through the Quran, whether it is through the words of His beloved, our Messenger, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, whether it is through the examples of His companions, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, or whether it is through the example of those who followed Him to the best of their ability. I'm speaking, of course, about the awliya, the friends of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He has informed us through all of these methods. And He has reminded us of His words again and again through the situations that we face on a daily basis. That surely life is filled with obstacles. There will always be something, some goal you are trying to accomplish, some end you are trying to complete. Sometimes those goals are completed and sometimes they remain incomplete. But the real issue is that not only has Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala informed us that this would happen, but He has also told us the solution for these things. What is the solution? It's a very, 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 very simple solution. If we're sitting here and having this discussion in the house of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then for those of us gathered here, it is the easiest solution. But before we can explain what this solution is, let's go back for a second. Because no matter what, we should all know that the person sitting in front of us and behind us and to the right and to the left, everybody has faced some kind of obstacle in his or her life. But we should ask ourselves for a small moment, what could be the greatest affliction that can befall a human being? Knowing what you know now, knowing what Allah and His Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam have already informed us, what you have learned from those information, what you have learned from that information, knowing what you know now, what could be the greatest obstacle for a human being to overcome? This is the kind of reflection Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala encourages us to take. The greatest affliction, we need to remember this. Out of all of the difficulties you have faced in your life, you are always looking back at the previous difficulty. Whatever difficulty you are in, you know at the bottom of your heart that you will come out of that difficulty. You know from experience that if the money is not enough today, it will be enough tomorrow. If you don't have a job today, you will have a job tomorrow. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala informs us of this up and down that we go through in life. فَإِنَّ مَعَ الْعُسْرِ يُسْرًا إِنَّ مَعَ الْعُسْرِ يُسْرًا. For indeed with hardship comes ease. Indeed with hardship comes ease. Means one after the other. Now you have to think, what kind of affliction, the greatest kind of affliction that can befall us, is an affliction that never ends. It's an affliction that never ends. And yet we know that everything in this life does, has, and will come to an end. So then you know that the greatest affliction a human being can face has very little to do with this life, and it has everything to do with the life that is to come. Because that life and everything pertaining to that life will last forever. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says of the denizens of both paradise and hell, خَالِدِينَ فِيهَا أَبَدًا. They will abide therein forever. Double emphasis. So then with this in mind now, what is the single greatest affliction that a human being can face? It is the affliction of whether or not to believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It is the affliction of whether or not to submit to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It is a question of whether or not to accept Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It doesn't seem like it's a big deal, especially for those of us who may have been born into this faith. But I promise you, this is the greatest affliction a human being can face. Ask those whom you know who have come to this path and accepted it willingly, how their lives were before, how they are now. No matter what kind of hardship they find themselves in, when they return to the question of their iman, there is no question for them. So, the solution to the greatest affliction that can befall a human being is what? Submission. This is why Islam is called Islam. It means to submit. It means to submit to something that exists beyond the pale of this world. It means to exist within this world and to acknowledge the existence of the Almighty. Now take this greatest solution for this greatest affliction and apply it to every single other affliction that you have in your life. The solution to whatever it is you're facing now is a derivative of that same submission. That's all it is. When you know that something has to end. For example, you're having a dry spell finding a job. You know that that dry spell is going to come to an end. But why can't you tolerate it in that moment? You intellectually understand that yes, this has to come to an end. But why can't you tolerate those moments then? It's because this thing is not settled in your heart. Just like the person who has not yet accepted the light of Iman into his heart. What was his solution? To submit to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So what is your solution? It is also to submit to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Every time you try to grab the solution with your own hands, 9 times out of 10, you will end in failure. And the 10th time it ends in success is only because of the help of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If you want to accelerate that help of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, why don't we remember Him in those moments then? And I don't mean just take His name. I don't mean just comforting ourselves that Allah is there. No. Why don't you actively submit to Him in those times? Whenever it feels like you can't handle what's in front of you, the simple answer is that is correct. Your assumption is correct. You can't handle it. With the tools and the power you have at your disposal, you cannot surmount the obstacles that are in front of you. So how will you surmount this obstacle? And how have you surmounted the obstacle that came before you? Submitting to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Accepting the light and the help of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This isn't something complicated like reciting istighfar or praying 2 rakat nafil. Although that is a part of the process and you should definitely make it a part of your routine. But it's as simple as flipping a switch in your heart to say, you know what? I can't change anything about this situation, so I accept it for what it is. The reason it's hard for us to do this is because our submission is not complete. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala takes us through the stages of life, not simply so that we can formally accept Him, but so that we can accept Him with the depth of our souls. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has described وُجُوهٌ يَوْمَئِذٍ نَاظِرَةٌ, faces on that day will be radiant. إِلَىٰ رَبِّهَا نَاظِرَةٌ, looking towards their Lord. He's talking about the people who have successfully navigated the obstacles of this life and who have attained their ultimate goal to witness Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now ask yourself, is that your ultimate goal? The reason why we can barely have any trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the reason why we can barely hold on to basic guiding principles is because we're barely holding on. We're living a life of attrition. We're taking steps backward. We're not taking steps forward. What does it mean for a believer to take a step forward? It's just another day where you are ready to submit to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Within each and every one of us, there's that one or two issues in which we want to grab it with our own hands, which we don't want to let go of. When we find the strength from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to relinquish these things, to consign them to Him, to submit to Him, then our submission is complete. But to do that, your goal has to be very different from what it is now. If our goals are only pertaining to this life, then just like this life, those goals will be temporary. You will not find any happiness behind any kind of temporary goal. The minute you get that job, within 6 months you're tired of the job. The minute you get that car, 6 months later you're tired of that car. Why? Because you have failed to include Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in your endeavors. That's why. If you look at that same car every day and say, wow, this is such a great blessing from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If that same car reminds you of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala every day, I promise you'll never get tired of that car. If that same job reminds you of the favor of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala every day, I promise you, you'll never get tired of that job. A person can get a job he absolutely hates, but if he remembers Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in that job, it will be the best thing for him. Include Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in your affairs. This is how you submit to Him on a daily basis. This is how you take 2 steps forward. A step forward for a believer, again, like we mentioned 2 weeks ago, is not to pick up weapons. The step forward for a believer is to submit to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and to be ready to accept the help of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes Huzur Kareem alayhi salatu wasalam and his companions with this ayat. أَمْ حَسِبْتُمْ أَن تَدْخُلُوا الْجَنَّةَ وَلَمَّا يَأْتِكُمْ مَثَلُ الَّذِينَ خَلَوْا مِنْ قَبْلِكُمْ. Do you think that you will enter paradise when the like of those things that came to the previous peoples has not yet come to you? مَسَّتْهُمُ الْبَأْسَاءُ وَالضَّرَّاءُ وَزُلْزِلُوا. They were touched with affliction and harm, and they were shook. حَتَّى يَقُولَ الرَّسُولُ وَالَّذِينَ مَعَهُ مَتَى نَصْرُ اللَّهِ. Until the messenger, each messenger of that time, along with the companions of that time, stretched out their hands and asked, when will the help of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala come? And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala within that ayat responds, أَلَا إِنَّ نَصْرَ اللَّهِ قَرِيبٌ. Listen closely, the help of Allah is close. The help of Allah does not come close until you are willing to submit in that moment, until you are willing to relinquish your desire in that moment. These aren't just small-time desires like sinning. These are long-term desires. Long-term desires that you're clutching in your hands. The key to your felicitation, rather your felicity and your felicitation, is to relinquish these things. Give them up to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allow them to take the course that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has planned. submit to Him like you submit every morning when you recite the kalima. And the help of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will be at your fingertips. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make it so for us. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us of those who walk the path that leads to Him with humility and sincerity. Allahumma salli wa sallim wa barik ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. There is one person's request for dua, Falahat Aga. She's in the ICU. There's a request for her shifa. اللهم صل على سيدنا وشفيعنا ومولانا محمد معدن الجود والكرم وآله وصحبه وبارك وسلم صلاة وسلام عليك يا سيدي يا رسول الله يا Allah. Falahat Aga and all of those who are afflicted with some kind of illness or some kind of difficulty, Ya Allah, we ask you to make it easy for them when we ask you to give them shifa. Allahumma shfi mardana, Allahumma shfi mardana, Allahumma shfi mardana. Allahumma salli wa sallim wa barik ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Please pray your sunnahs.